what we see since 2014, I don't think is the kind of mass politics of the Hindu right that we saw when there was mobilization for Babri Masjid. What we see since 2014 is a coup d'etat. It is the functioning of state power. So when you see Tanishq, for example, taking off the ad, it's not common people. These are paid trolls. This is their job. It is their job, for example, to make Sushant Singh Rajput's tragic suicide an entry point for the purging of Bollywood. If you look at so it's a cultural purge of Bollywood, because Bollywood is a space, despite all its problems, where which is a syncretic space.
The Professor Nivedita Menon that I got to know, that was at the turn of this millennium in 2001, was a source of all kind of cult imagination for many of us. I remember many of my classmates, friends, wanted to emulate you after doing courses with you. We got to know a cult teacher, Nivedita Menon, and I was always curious as a teacher as to what led to the making of that teacher, who inspired so much of following.
I don't actually know how to answer your question, but perhaps I can talk about teaching.
Yeah.
And which we all do. And in many ways, actually, in the last let's say 7-8 years, since 2014 to be specific, many teachers have actually emerged as heroes, and students. So because universities have been the target of attack, and the reason why universities have been the target of attack is because they're spaces of critical thinking. So we've all been very critical of our universities, the public university system, the extent to which it was actually representative of marginalized groups, and so on and so forth. We've been very critical, but it seems that we did do something right. One, in the way in which the expansion of university education to larger and larger sections of people, partly because of the implementation of the Mandal Commission reservations, and then the expansion of general seats as a result. So really a large numbers of students got incorporated into university spaces, and they brought their politics, they brought their understanding, they brought their questioning, they were in conversation with one another, and so on. And it seems that we did manage in universities to provide a space, partly inside and partly outside the classroom, for these churnings to take place. So if you look, JNU was, of course, it was seen as a particular threat, so it was attacked in a particular way. But actually, if you look across the country, University of Hyderabad, Banaras Hindu University, Punjab University, they're just, I can't even list the universities in which students challenged fee hikes, they challenged curfew hours for women in hostels, and so on. So I think in that space, teaching acquired a status and a role and a responsibility that even though we have actually carried on our teaching in similar ways before, suddenly it became clear that this was a subversive activity. We thought we were just doing our job. We took classes, we taught courses, we did boring stuff, we graded assignments, we did entrance exams, and suddenly all of this became apparently it turned out to be subversive activity. So you did mention an earlier date, supposedly when you came to know of me, but so this is one kind of thing where teaching acquires, in Turkey, Hundreds of academics are in jail for having signed a letter, a
Mhm.
statement of
But
support.
I was requesting you to go back in time and
Mhm.
trace the becoming of a teacher who was deeply into interactive relation with students in talking about feminism, feminist politics. So,
Yeah, in a way, I mark my teaching as the beginning of my politicization almost, because although I was a student in JNU, I did my MA and MPhil from JNU. I was not politically active in JNU really at all. I was mobilized by left groups, but I was part of those who were mobilized. And we had a feminist reading group, and
mm,
we may have brought out a leaflet or two, but I wasn't really politically active. But I found that when I started teaching, and that was in 1987 actually, that I started teaching in LSR, and you encounter, a successive batches of young people, and your academic work and your scholarship is let's say influenced by Marxism and feminism and all of that. Speaking about it in the classroom seemed to require some other kind of work. It somehow automatically, and I think many of us, this is not this is not an experience unique to me. I think many of us would have experienced this as teachers, that you start teaching and and you realize that what you believe academically and intellectually has political ramifications. So
mm,
I do date my own politicization to my teaching. And then you get involved in the kinds of questions students are asking, you have conversations with them, and so on, right? So you learn from them as well. So I think teaching as a profession, at least in the public universities of India today, even today, has the capacity to push your boundaries. If you're open to that,
mm,
you don't. So there's this kind of phrase which the UGC keeps using, imparting knowledge or some such phrase.
right,
So I
right.
don't think we impart. I don't think any serious teacher imparts knowledge, right? I mean, you would agree. We learn, and then we certainly because of our life stage, we happen to be better equipped to read certain texts, say, or whatever. But once that enters the space of the classroom, courses change, questions change. With every batch you teach it differently, so
Right.
it's a dialectic. It's a yeah.
Mm,
I can't imagine doing anything other than teaching. I think most of us who
right.
teach do feel that way.
Mm,
Although perhaps at some point one might want to note that with the new national education policy of 2020
mm,
and with the decision in that policy to end permanent jobs, to increase privatization, and to basically control the public university, control research agendas. What we will be seeing, I'm not very sure,
mhm,
but I do believe that higher education should be free completely,
mm,
and that the state should invest. And this is the reason, because
mm.
it produces all of us as thinking intellectuals.
Right. So let's come to that point. I mean, one is familiar with your discomfort with the way political science has happened, particularly in context of India. You have uh, shared your anxiety, apprehensions about the nature and scope of political science. What was it, and where do you see it headed now? I mean, what is the future of political studies in India, so to say?
Um, I think that political science has transformed itself to a large extent because of the continuing questioning by scholars, by newer faculty, by younger faculty, and so on. But also, it's an older process. I would go back to Sudipta Kaviraj and Partha Chatterjee, uh, who were, I think, among those, I would say, the key figures, I should say, who marked a shift in political science as a discipline, which was and still is in the mainstream, very focused on institutions, formal power, political parties, elections, all of that. But that is no longer the only thing that is done in political science, and all that work is very important. I'm not denying the importance of that work, but I think increasingly there are larger and larger numbers of scholars, both younger scholars and people who've been in the system for a while, who are beginning to see, or who have been seeing for some time, that that you start with an object of study. You don't start with what the discipline permits you to see, because we know that the discipline, all disciplines have an object of study which is produced, and it's produced and viewed through that disciplinary lens. But and that's what led at an earlier and perhaps led at a certain time, but perhaps even now in some departments, where a student might say, I want to study, let's say, X, and they would be told, but this is not political science. I want to study suicide bombing. This, you should go to a sociology department. Or, something. There's that kind of. There used to be, and there, I'm not. It hasn't gone away. That kind of policing of disciplinary borders. But that's, I think, much less now in most departments, but also in political science. And so you will see that, and you use the term political studies. We all now prefer to say political studies rather than political science, because that nomenclature reflected the anxiety of that 50s debate about, is political science a science? Can it claim to predict? Can it claim to, be a science in that way? And we are no longer burdened with that. So when we start with an object of study, and the method evolves from that, and then you might be using methods of many disciplines. I mean, you might be using the archives, and you might be using interviews, you might be using texts, you might be reading statuary. How can you understand Dalit politics without looking at what Mayawati did? I mean, with those statues, what is going on there, right? So that kind of, so when you choose an object or a puzzle or some phenomenon, and then see what methods work, I think that is more and more being accepted in political science. And it has to do, of course, with the entry into political science of feminist scholarship, Dalit scholarship. Because what happens then is that you have an object, you have a phenomenon. When you want to study that phenomenon, and feminism, anything called feminist studies or Dalit studies, is already out of disciplinary framework. So this is actually a fairly, I would say, at least 2 decades old. It's not a brand new phenomenon at all anymore. And I think political studies now is going in that direction, and I think that's a very good thing.
Looks like this gatekeeping phenomenon has been quite pan-disciplinary, so to say. I mean, I have heard this question in sociology departments as well. How is your work sociological? You're working on the floor. It's not supposed to be. You're supposed to go to language and literature department, or somebody who would be working on media would be called to join media studies department.
Exactly.
So, do you think it's disappearing altogether? Because I heard it's a lot of PhD students still complain about this kind of questions they face.
Yeah, I don't think it's disappeared. I don't think that that kind of sense that a particular discipline needs a particular method, and methodological rigor involves using very particular styles of doing research. I don't think that idea has gone away, but I think it's more contested. So it's very likely that even within faculty, which is, let's say, conducting an interview of a potential PhD scholar, I can actually imagine what happens when the scholar leaves the room, when they decide whether to take her or not. There would be some faculty saying, this is really not sociology at all or not political science at all. And there would be others. I don't think it passes without question anymore. And I don't think it's necessarily any longer generational. I think even someone like I would be on the older side of the generation in any department today. And I know I would find colleagues who would agree with me. Yeah, my own center is quite interdisciplinary, and so there's a way in which we want to retain the idea of method. I think people like us scholars, or the way in which we want to work with our disciplines, that there has to be a method. Just tell us what the method is, and that is it. I'm going to study this Dalit politics of UP of the last 2 decades, or just before, or during the period of Mayawati. I want to study the statuary. All right, you need to see how scholars of visual studies do that work.
Right.
So it's not that you go there, you just look at the statues, and then you say something completely banal, right? I mean, we're not saying there's no such thing as methodological rigor. We would say go attend maybe some classes at School of Art and Aesthetics, or read the work that theorists of the visual are bringing out. Look how they read, how to read that kind of image. So I think we would insist on methodological rigor, and that might include sometimes looking at tables and learning how to read tables. It's not as if it no longer matters, as if tables and statistics don't matter. By tables, I mean showing decennial growth or whatever, right? So we need to be able to read that as well as images. So I think there is a shift, I think, and for some time, there's been a change for some time. But I think a more interesting possible thing, I mean, a phenomenon that maybe we need to mark and notice and work more on, is that at least for 10 years, in India, there are many faculties and departments in multiple disciplines that have recognized the need to not be caught up in Western theory, in such a exclusively in Western theory, let me say, so that when one now when one hears the ideologues of the RSS say we have to go back to indigenous theory, etc. It's okay. That work has been going on for about 10 or 15 years, and not from a Hindu right-wing perspective. That work has been going on, and if you look at, I mean, Sundar Sarukar is doing something when he had in Manipal, that whole philosophy. The idea was to be able to read Natya Shastra along with aesthetics, Western aesthetics. The idea, and that's happening in many centers, and I'm sure you would agree that sociology too.
Yes.
So I think that thing, and I know that I find theory from Africa very, very productive. Any material that's available to us in English, there's some very, very interesting theorizing, and increasingly one also feels the need to be comparing and thinking about Ambedkar and Fanon together and so on, right? So you see all that happening already. It's been happening for about a decade and a half at least.
So I also recall, I mean, in your critical engagement with the nature of political science in India, you also had certain pedagogic concern, the way we transact discussions on political issues in the classroom, or what kind of content we tend to cover in our courses. Those kind of apprehensions too.
Can you spell out a little bit? I can't quite get.
As you said right in the beginning, that act of teacher is also political, right? So that coming together of pedagogy and politics in the classroom. That was also your...
Okay, so right. So I think partly, so see, in a way, our politics, I think I have two answers to this. So one is that I think, in a way, our politics doesn't actually affect the syllabus in a way. If I have to teach Hobbes, I teach Hobbes. So I teach the syllabus, and it's not as if my political understanding enters the classroom necessarily when I'm teaching a course on political thought. And I think this is something we need to state and take very seriously, because there is some implication in the attacks on us that we bring our politics into the classroom, supposedly. And when I say politics and when you say politics, we're really talking about a kind of, as you said, pedagogical politics.
Right.
And not in which means that a classroom would have people with different views, and the idea is not to get them to think like you, but to get them to think and to ask questions and to be critical of the teacher and of the course and everything. So that's one kind of answer about the more direct. I mean, I know the kind of thing that I would say is that if there's a direct space in which I have to make any kind of statement of politics, then I make it very clear that I'm stating it. This is my politics. But the text, you have to read the text on its own terms. But there's another way, in a more interesting way, in which our politics enters the classroom, and that is when we get the chance to make our own syllabus or rework the syllabus, and which is not a privilege that many, for example, I taught for years in Delhi University without being able to do that, because it's so large, such a large university. There are so many people involved in the creation of any one course, and it has to be taught the same way across 78 colleges, etc. Right? So one didn't have that the kind of space one has now, or one which one may soon lose, who knows. But for example, if one has a course on political thought, and there's a way in which political thought is meant to be taught in mainstream political science, which is basically, what used to be called dead white men, and there might be a couple of dead brown men, and that's it. And instead, you say that I will restructure the political thought course so that you're reading Kant and Ambedkar in the same space, or you're reading Kant and critical race theory, which has been critical of Kant, in the same space, which is usually not done and this is not only for India. So you would have critical race theory taught in departments which do that kind of work, and philosophy departments will chugging along in the same way, teaching Kant the way he has always been taught. So I guess our politics enters in these ways where Kancha Ilaiya is theory. I don't need to be told what is theory and whose is the theory that I can teach.
Right.
So I think our politics enters by shaking up these spaces, and many of us have been doing this kind of thing for a while. But of course, one needed to, in this system, either be in a university where one had that space. You also needed to have established yourself in terms of seniority. Had I tried as a very young teacher to say, look, let's teach all these things together. Let's teach feminism and so on, and all in the same page, rather than having a separate paper on feminism and a separate paper on political thought. I'm not sure how seriously I would have been taken unless there was a senior scholar who agreed, or there were enough people in the department who agreed. So yes, one is able to do these things as one goes up in the hierarchy. But I'm hoping that it means that we normalize some of this, that people who come after us will simply take it for granted. Yes, of course, that's how political thought should be taught. It should just become a normalized thing, and then some other form of teaching might emerge. It's not like we've reached the highest point by doing this. There'll be some other ways of teaching that would emerge.
So on that point, let me reminisce my personal wow moment I had about your scholarship. Once again, to embarrass you a little bit. So that was also that's also connected with this whole idea of theorizing from the South. And I saw that performed version of possibility of theorizing from South when you responded to uh, almost 1 hour lecture by Zizek, and your 20 to 30 minutes response to it.
15 or something. I was given very short period. Yeah.
You simply dismantled him, and he became so restless to defend himself.
Yes,
The aftermath was even better. So, what was it? Do you revisit that? Why such discomfort with Zizek?
No, I'm not really. Having understood what Zizek is doing, I'm no longer interested in his work. I mean, it doesn't offer me anything, and I think increasingly, I mean, he's a superstar, but increasingly you see more thoughtful engagements with his work, and his proud claiming of Eurocentrism, for example, right? That he thinks it's a good thing that the world is Eurocentric because Europe brought modernity, and you shouldn't be stuck in your. In fact, he uses phrases like, I think in that particular talk he used a phrase like, do you want to be stuck in your little field singing your little songs, right? Rather, the implication is, as I said, wouldn't you rather enter our well-lit salon and have a little wine and cheese, right? I mean, that's the implication. So I'm putting this obviously rather casually, but there's a real issue with his philosophy in that sense, that it's extremely masculinist, extremely Eurocentric, proudly Christian. So my discomfort with his work was all of that. And it's also interesting that just as I was about to speak, when he finished speaking and he sat down and I was being introduced and we were sitting next to each other on the stage, and they were doing the introduction thing of me, and he said, so now you will go and say, so now it's your turn to go and say, so this is what Professor Zizek said. And I thought, wow, that's really arrogant, because he is I wouldn't say that if a student was going to respond to me. I wouldn't say, oh, are you going to go now and say this is what Professor Menon said? We don't. So his arrogance is phenomenal. And he's it's almost amusing, actually, his arrogance. It's really like he has no clue how arrogant he is. But that's his personality, and that's a different matter. And it was a funny moment because he had no idea what I was about to say.
Exactly.
So I was thinking to myself, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But philosophically, I think I find him just not interesting. I love his anecdotes. His anecdotes are absolutely brilliant, his jokes and so on. But I have nothing to learn from a philosophy which actually cannot take on board feminism at all. It cannot take on board the idea that the European Enlightenment is not and cannot, that its claims to universalism are over. It's like he talks like a hardcore 20th century philosopher in the 21st century. So I'm not very sure what. I think he's just an exciting speaker. That I will give him that. He holds you engaged. He has you on the edge of your seat. He's a phenomenal speaker. And that's why he can fill halls. And possibly that also appeals still, right? That must be appealing in Europe to a large number of philosophers. That kind of strong, muscular defense of an idea that has been taken apart all over the globe. It must be very reassuring to have a superstar doing that.
Particularly because in large part of the world, including in India, lots of teachers have become habitual of teaching through PPT slides alone, and rather than talking to students. In that kind of scenario, if there is a speaker who is like speaking his mind, no matter how much of garbage would come out, but, that really appeals the audience. I'm sure he gets the nightmare of that evening several times.
I doubt it. I have no doubt that he's it's completely erased from his hard disk. I mean, really, I don't think I matter to him at
No,
all.
but
So,
in one of his later works, probably he had 4 sentences or 5 sentences dedicated to Ambedkar, and I felt
mhm.
that probably that was his defense.
Yeah, you know what? But remember, he was invited by Navyana. He was
Yes,
invited by S. Anand.
right.
And so Anand did give him Ambedkar to read and so on. So that I'm not surprised by. I don't think that had anything to do with my intervention. It just show that he had visited, I mean, that he had come to India and read a little bit. I mean, but he, of course, like we wouldn't be able to talk about, or we wouldn't be permitted to talk about Foucault having read, like, skimmed a couple of his works, but he can talk about Ambedkar having skimmed a couple of his works. So that's Zizek, you know.
Yeah. Acha, I have heard in chats over coffee, that kind of situation in drawing room conversations or some kind of, adda bazi. I have heard that there is this, probably there is some kind of critical self-realization amongst political sociologists and political scientists as well, that they failed to understand the political behavior of Indians in last 1 decade, and therefore there was this rise of a particular variety of politics.
Mm,
And
mm,
also,
mm.
in a very lighter vein, I have heard people saying maybe it is a common sense idea that Mr. Amit Shah is far better a political scientist in contemporary India than many of the seasoned political scientists. I'm sure this is all rubbish, but I would like to.
I don't agree with the second part at all. I'll just come back to that. But I think it's a good thing if we are self-critical and if we look back. And by we, I mean a certain kind of scholarship that took secularism, which I will just say secularism, but it's such a problematic, complex
Yeah.
term, but for the moment, just in the you know what I mean, in a you know what I mean kind of a way, I'm going to use the word secularism. So those of us who took secularism and the constitution and so on for granted, and democracy and freedom of expression, I think at some point, from 92, from the demolition of the Babri Masjid onwards, we have had I think a kind of a real rethink on where did we go wrong? Why didn't we understand what was happening? And I think one of the key recognitions has been I left, the liberal, left liberal, secular kind of scholarship. There's no doubt that one of the biggest weaknesses or the gaps was our complete inability to take on board caste politics, understand the importance of caste politics, and I don't just mean Dalit politics. I mean the way in which caste works. I think that realization has been we've been forced to come to terms with, partly because of Hindu right, the politics of the Hindu right, which knows how to mobilize caste very effectively, but partly because of Dalit politics and Dalit scholarship, which has exploded, on the landscape in the past couple of decades. So we've learned a lot, and we are still learning. Uh, but I think that there's a I don't I don't think we can talk about it in the same way now. I mean to say that the debate of the 90s, in which people like Ashish Nandi and so on
Right.
reshaped the field, etc. Um, that has, I think, that's one stage. But what we see since 2014, I don't think is the kind of mass politics of the Hindu right that we saw when there was mobilization for Babri Masjid. What
Mm.
we see since 2014 is a coup d'etat.
Mm.
It is the functioning of state power. So when you see Tanishq, for example, taking off the ad, it's not common people. These
Right.
are paid trolls.
Mm.
This is their job. It is
Mm.
their job, for example, to make Sushant Singh Rajput's tragic suicide
Mm.
an entry point for the purging of Bollywood. If
Mm.
you look at so it's a cultural purge of Bollywood, because Bollywood is a space, despite all its problems, which is a syncretic space. which does not, it's got multiple voices speaking, and of course many voices from, I don't like to say Bollywood again, it's a phrase that comes just very quickly to one's mouth, but the Bombay film industry, the many people have spoken up against the politics of Hindu Rashtra. So Sushant Singh Rajput's suicide was weaponized by the RSS and by by Hindu Rashtra politics. So I think what we are seeing since 2014 is a coup d'etat. It is a complete takeover of state institutions, of courts, of the police, and if you look at any kind, and the so-called mob lynchings, so the communal riot framework has been replaced by lynchings, which is more quotidian, ubiquitous. It can happen at any time. It's not one big riot, which also happened in Delhi, but that is not the model anymore. But they will use that model also when it suits them. And Paul Brass, reading whom Sharjeel, according to the police, was radicalized by reading Paul Brass. It's in their charge sheet because they found Paul Brass's book among his books. He calls it systems, systems of riot production. He studied, Brass has studied riots and what so-called riots and how they come into being. So there's a structure in place. And I think if we keep talking, if we keep up the conversation in that same self-critical mode, where we didn't understand the religiosity of the people kind of a thing, or we didn't understand how Hindu India really was, I think we would be wrong and we would be heading in the wrong direction. Because in fact, what we see now, yes, there is tremendous Islamophobia, and the politics of Hindu Rashtra is able to tap into that, there's no doubt. But I think that all of that is buttressed and amplified by state power. And by the fact that this regime has absolutely no qualms about using money, Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed. They will use everything. Whether they win the election or not, they will be in power in a state, etc. So what we are seeing, I think, now is the effects of a coup d'etat, an effective coup d'etat by the RSS, which never has to actually contest elections, but it controls. So those conversations over coffee about how the nature of politics has changed, I think they're a decade too late. I think I think they're dated. Those, for example, Yogen Yadav wrote that piece. I can't immediately recollect the reference. I think it was in the print. It was a critique of secularism, but in the 80s style, I should say in the 90s style. I think that stage of the debate is over. I think now we have to understand that Hindu Rashtra, in fact, has shown that it excludes everybody except the Brahminical North Indian identity, because it has no space for Dalits, it has no space for Muslims, of course, it has no space for, increasingly it's very clear, for women who are not simply reproducing children for Hindu Rashtra, and so on. So it's become very clear that they no longer, it's not even about consolidating the Hindu community anymore, because these continuous and very violent and very obvious attacks on Dalits, how we have to see it as that even in order to consolidate the Hindu community, the RSS and the BJP are unable to control the deep caste hatred that upper caste, so-called upper caste, Savarnas in India bear towards the Dalits. So what you see in UP, it has been pointed out that in UP, if you see the attacks by Thakurs, it is a kind of sabak sikhana hai, because Sapa and Baspa, when they were in power, they did manage to control things. They did manage to have non-Brahmin police and all of that, and it did make a difference. And now it's our turn. So now they're just violently, so it's not just rape and murder of women. We know something like there's been a 47% increase in attacks on Dalits in UP since 2014, just since 2014. And so we need, if we don't take into account all of this, we will have no idea of how to engage. And now we have to engage directly with the state. It's not about changing people's minds and perceptions. I don't think everybody will eventually love one another and live in peace and harmony, but the role of the state was to keep this under control, right? Was to keep, okay, I don't like the fact that you eat meat, but just do it in your space. But now you cannot do it anywhere. Now, this is not being necessarily said by ordinary people. This is the RSS. It's a very, what is the word? It's very systematic. It's a systematic, planned, state-driven agenda now. So we have to understand it differently.
So let's
the second part, sorry, you were saying about Amit Shah being the political scientist. He's not a political scientist. He doesn't understand India. He's creating India. He doesn't understand India better than us. He's creating an India in which he is playing a certain kind of caste arithmetic. As we know, Dalit is not a caste identity. And when we say Dalit as academics, we are not necessarily always taking into account that there are different castes there, some of whom ally with the BSP, and the BJP is taking the other castes away, the non-Chamar, etc. You know, I mean, there's a kind of caste arithmetic that they play. They play they know how to use money to buy politicians. He's a politician. He's trying to create a new India. He doesn't understand India better than us. I think that's a ridiculous statement. I completely disagree with it.
Okay. So you briefly mentioned Bollywood, and Bollywood is also about ongoing Me Too or some variety of Me Too. So from there, let's go to academia had its own share of Me Too internationally, globally. And then so did Indian academia. One is familiar partly with your position and various kind of responses from younger female colleagues from various universities. How did you how do you reflect on it?
Okay, sorry, go
on. So what kind of feminist possibilities emerge from this variety of intervention?
See, first of all, I don't think it was younger colleagues versus older colleagues, because I think there was a large number of our contemporaries, those of us who wrote that statement, which was published on Kaafila, which called for due process. There were many of our contemporaries by age who disagreed with us, and there were a large number of younger people who agreed with us, younger feminists who agreed with us. So it's not generational. It was presented as such for a long time, but I think it's very clear now that it wasn't generational. So that I want to set aside. That's not the point. The point is that I still hold that the politics of the list and the politics of Me Too were very different. They're different, and and in our understanding, we fully support a Me Too kind of politics. I won't speak for everybody on that list. I'm doing this talk, so I'll say we, but I'm obviously not necessarily representing all of them. The fact is that Me Too gave the space to even keep the complainant anonymous if necessary, but to say this is what happened. And by saying this is what happened, Me Too was able to reveal the range of behavior that is sexually predatory, that is sexual harassment, that makes the workplace an almost impossible space to negotiate for many women, the power that shoots through it, etc. By saying this is what happened, Me Too actually produced that, and it made the phenomenon visible. The problem with the list was that it simply named a large number of men, some of whom, and there was absolutely no, it was carelessly done. And later they started saying, a couple of the originators of the list started saying, oh, we just put it together in a great hurry, we had our exams and so on and so forth. And I find this, I find it problematic. Now, when we brought out the statement, it was not meant to be an attack on the list at all. It was meant, and what we were doing is part of an old tradition in Indian feminism, where we call upon each other. We disagree. All the people on that list have been on opposing sides of other debates. So we didn't see it as an attack on the people who brought out the list. That was not what we intended. And the list simply, the list had no credibility because it listed a large number of names, at least one of whom, Vidyut Chakrabarti, has already been found guilty of sexual harassment. So you put someone who has been through due process, and the number of people who were involved in making sure that he was punished under due process, and the work that it took and the work that went into it, that is the way. So you put a name out there of someone who has in fact, where due process has actually worked. Then there are a number of names of people who we all know were in consensual relationships with students, and it was not the students who had put their name on the list. That was also, that it became, that is, it was not the student with whom they were having the relationship. That also became clear. Now, I do think that it is entirely inappropriate for any teacher to have a romantic relationship with a student that they are grading, that they are teaching. It is completely unacceptable. Unacceptable. In JNU, in maybe 2010 or something like that, I've forgotten, there was a committee where we were looking into things. And one of the things that some of us said is that, and it wasn't taken up at all at that time, that if there is a romantic relationship between a teacher and a student, it has to be declared, it has to be made public, and that teacher can no longer grade the student or supervise her or any of these things. I'm saying her because it's usually a male teacher and a female student, but I'm not writing off the possibility of a female teacher and a female or male student. So that was our understanding, that it is simply not acceptable because it creates a hostile work environment for everybody else. But then you're not saying any of that by just bringing out a list. Right. It's not. It's like it's just a jumble of names, and then what happens is that someone like Partha Shashi publicly says, "What is it about me? Exactly. What do you have to say about me?" And then nothing to say. Yeah. So you can't do this. And then there was that kind of huge attempt to produce it as the networks of rumor and gossip through which women work. And I mean, that's too kind. There's a feminism. So I know which feminism I stand for. There's a feminism which tries to empower women to speak up and not to be terrified and not to rely on rumor and gossip networks and so on. I mean, all of us who signed that letter have personally been involved in sexual harassment committees. You can't talk about it. We don't talk about those cases. And even till today, we work to the extent possible. Of course, sexual harassment committees have been dissolved. The new law is completely problematic. The new ICCs are completely controlled by institutions. It's a very problematic scenario. Yeah. But even so, to the extent possible, and before the ICCs were brought in, we are all still working with the issue of sexual harassment. So I mean, if you're asking me a couple of years or 2-3 years down the line, what am I saying about sexual harassment? I'm saying the same things I said there, that it is an issue, that that the sexualizing of the university space through supposedly consensual relationships is deeply problematic. If you happen to fall in love with your student, I'm not saying that is never possible. Please do not grade her and do not grade her colleagues. Does it make any sense? You are in love with X, and in a class with 100 students, you will grade her and you will grade the other 100 students, and you think you're going to be objective. I mean, and mostly it's men who do this, and I think this is an issue. And as I was talking to a male friend, and And he said, earlier when you people brought out that policy suggestion in JNU that romances should be declared and teachers should back off. He said, I thought you were being so policing and discipline, but now I understand what you're saying. And I said, well, thank you very much. But nobody had to tell me or my female colleagues that it is inappropriate to hit on an attractive young man or woman in your class. Nobody had to tell us that. Why is it that men have to be even told this? How does it appear to be all right? And you have a power relationship, you're grading the person, you're writing recommendation letters, you're supervising her dissertation, you're selecting her examiners. In what universe did you have to be told that this is not okay? I mean, he did look very sheepish when I said this. It's not as if one is. I mean, there's a in that case in the US in which the woman professor whose name I'm forgetting. There was that case of the woman professor who had not quite an affair, but a very sexualized relationship. She's lesbian. She had a very sexualized relationship with a male student. I can't remember her name. It doesn't matter. Her name doesn't matter. But one of the things she said was that the teacher-student relationship is erotic, and that this is kind of bureaucratizing the relationship between teacher and student and making it flat. And I found it very surprising because she's a Avital Ronell. That's the name. I was surprised because she's a philosopher, and to reduce erotic to an individual romance, I was very surprised because it is erotic in the sense of that there's a charge, there's an eye contact which we're losing in Zoom. I find the whole business of even doing a lecture. I mean, here it's you and me, but normally you don't, and most people have their videos actually switched off because of bandwidth and other reasons. I mean, they're present but not present. There is, and it's erotic in the sense of an energy. It's a dynamic, collective energy. To reduce that to sexual energy between one person and another person, I find it very surprising. And I don't think it's about that. To say that these relationships are inappropriate is not to be bureaucratic, but to recognize the power relationship and the power dynamic. So I would say that we need to recognize. I think all our universities need to have a policy which recognizes, and it's not a ban, but it's a declaration. You have to declare it. If you're the kind of person who's going to have a fresh affair in every batch, and I know teachers like this, I'm sorry to say, if you're going to have a new romance, then go and declare it every year. Declare it. This year I'm seeing this woman, and next year I'm seeing this woman or this man. And do it. That's just do it then. So it's not bureaucratic, I think, to do that. And in that sense, I know what I obviously agree that that sexual harassment, and here I've spent some time talking about consensual relationships, but most of the time it's sheer harassment, it's power play, it's demeaning, it's degrading, it's all of that. And we need to bring back the Vishakha guidelines, actually, strangely. I think this law is dreadful. So the law has to be made actually more compliant with the Vishakha guidelines, not the other way around. In the sense that what really happened after the law came is that the sexual harassment committees had to be made compliant with the new law, which AUD actually did, and so they managed to retain their sexual harassment committees. Even JNU did, but JNU administration was not interested in retaining GS Cash, so they shut it down. And now there are ICCs in which every complainant is insulted and humiliated and made to feel like a complete liar, and it's just horrific what happens in ICCs. So we do need to, I don't believe this is the end of the story. I do believe that we will have to keep struggling and win back some things. And one of the things is, I think, to set up sexual harassment committees along with Vishakha guidelines again.
Right. So it looks like there would be, if there is an aftermath of this pandemic, there is going to be continuity in the struggle for procedure-based feminist interventions, and more so because of the cases that we see around, not only in academia, also around. You rightly mentioned some of the cases in UP and all. So there has been more robust intervention at systemic level.
Which will include actually really rethinking the police, by the way.
Right.
Because the police is acting like the army of the Hindu Rashtra. And there will have to be some voices that will speak up from within the police, or else we have to. I mean, there's this demand to defund the police in the US. In the context of Black Lives Matter, defunding the police is a very big demand, which is basically to cut down on securitization and invest in developing the community resources for safety. So if you take JNU, for example, security budget has gone up and library funds have been cut, and the security is basically used against faculty and teachers. So, over policed and under protected. This is the situation. This is a phrase that comes out of the US. The Black community is over-policed and underprotected, and we are over-policed and underprotected. So when we talk about procedures in institutions like universities, that's one thing. But where I think a bigger conversation needs to start about the police and the role of the police in the UP, in Delhi in particular. Something we need to have a large conversation.
All right. So one thing which I always ask in the end from everyone these days, in spite of all these things around you, how do you keep yourself humored?
Yeah. It's actually only possible by switching off to a certain extent. And I have that luxury. Many of my friends don't, who are already in jail or who have been listed as responsible for the violence which actually RSS group started in Northeast Delhi. So I have the luxury of being able to switch off because I'm this time around not in that list and in that range of people. So I have used this period as one in which I've been able to read and write without the pressures of administration and university administration, teaching.
Right.
So it's almost I feel almost guilty saying it, but it has been a peculiarly healing time because in JNU we've been at the receiving end, of
Yes.
often it's been a war and
Yes.
it's not over. It's
Right.
not over, but it's a kind of a period in which, in any case, one couldn't do much. So the administration is carrying on its whatever. So in a way, for me personally, it has been a calm interregnum, and I'm very glad to see that the protests have started again publicly. So I've had enough of the interregnum. I'm ready to step out.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
This is
Thank you. This
wonderful.
is so much fun. Thank you so much.